Hey friends, welcome to Embracing Your Season. I'm your host, Paige Clingenpeel. We're just so excited that you are joining us today. I am about to introduce to you someone you've already met before, actually in episode 41, so you're going to want to take a look at that. But on the show today is Elizabeth Urbanowicz. Now, she is phenomenal. Let me tell you a little bit about her background and why it informs her ability to speak into the subject we'll be discussing today. So she is an author, a speaker, an experienced educator. And let me tell you, for all those parents out there that went through 2020, we know that it has to take an amazing person to be an educator in the world that we have today. And that is not me, friends. She is the founder of Foundation Worldview. Absolutely go and check that out. She started her career as an elementary teacher in Christian schools. And this, friends, is where she quickly saw the need for the resources that would help students think critically about the world around them. Now, when she couldn't find the materials because she went out looking for them, she decided this might be God's calling on my life. And so she started creating her own. Today, we're going to have an amazing conversation. It is going to be potentially a difficult one because it does refer to sex and gender. And so mamas out there doing carpool and laundry and allowing your kiddos to do puzzles while you're doing these things. Maybe it's time to put in your headphones so that we can have some of these conversations where it might not necessarily be the right timing to bring up some of these topics with your kids. So Elizabeth wrote a new book. Would love for you guys to check that out. It's Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design, 40 questions and answers on sexuality and gender, right? Doesn't that get you right there? It's like, yes, you need this book. And all of her information, where you can find this book, as well as Foundation Worldview, is in the show notes. So absolutely take a minute, check it out, support this ministry because, friends, it will equip you to have some of these hard conversations in your home, helping you to make your children follow and be a disciple of Jesus. And that, friends, is what we want for our kids, is it not? So join me now in welcoming Elizabeth Urbanowicz on this edition of Embracing Your Season. Elizabeth, I'm so glad to have you back on the show. Thank you for joining us again. This is such a fun yet hard topic to discuss.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on again today, Paige. I'm just really excited to be able to chat with you again.
Well, it's interesting. So your book that's coming out and it talks about sexuality and gender. So tell us a little bit about what sparked this desire to even write such a book for the parents out there.
Yes. I'm sure that some of your listeners might be a little bit confused because in my background is in education. And it's like, well, sexuality is not a topic to be explored in education. It really belongs, God designed the family to talk about this. And so how did I, as an educator get into this? And really, it's just as I started running Foundation Worldview, people would write in questions, mainly parents, just questions about how do we talk with our kids, just about various topics. And the number one topic that we receive questions about is about sexuality.
Absolutely.
And so just seeing the need for this type of resource. And even though I myself am not a parent, so I'm not having these conversations with my own children because I don't have my own children. However, my area of expertise is taking more complex theological and philosophical and cultural issues and translating those concepts down into biblically faithful language for kids between the ages of 4 and 12. So that's really how this project even got started, just by the volume of parents that were writing in and looking for help. And how do I talk with my child about these really tricky topics?
Oh my goodness. I always joke about this is because I'm a therapist, right? I'm a licensed mental health therapist. My specialty area is adolescence. And I am amazing about talking about gender and sexuality, especially within a Christian worldview, but within the public school system and even integrating some of the biblical principles without actually explicitly saying that. I'm so good at doing that with other people's kids, like so good. And then as my kids got older and I was integrating it naturally in conversations, which I'm sure you're going to talk about the importance of doing that. But as I started getting older and their awkwardness in the way that I was even discussing it started rubbing off and making me feel awkward. I was like, I did not anticipate this at all. And so you're right. This is one of those conversations that are absolutely necessary, but we oftentimes feel ill-equipped. And whether that's because our family and origin didn't know how to discuss it. I know I come from that where it was not a healthy conversation. And then on the flip side, as we're reading the biblical worldview, there is some confusion in that. And so maybe just start out by talking through how should parents even start talking about sexual purity without making the child maybe feel guilt or shame or something along those lines?
Yeah, well, I always recommend that parents first off shift their mindset from having the talk
Oh,
to
yeah.
having dozens, if not hundreds, of little talks along the way. Because
Hmm.
sexuality is a huge area of life. It impacts so much of what we do. And in any other area of life, if we want our children to live healthy, God honoring lives, we're not going to have one conversation.
Right.
We don't have one
Yep.
conversation about how this is how you drive a car, this is how you do your homework, this is how you like cook food. It takes training, systematic training. And so it's similar with our kids. And
Hmm.
so I recommend actually that parents have the first of many sexuality based conversations with their child or their children starting around the age of 4, which I
Wow.
know is so
That's gonna
much
blow some
younger.
minds out there, but
Yes.
I see the value. I mean, there is probably research backed in this. Is that right?
Yes, and actually there's 2 main reasons why I recommend this. And the first is just I don't know if there's actually a term in psychology for this page, you would know this rather than me. But there's just this phenomenon where whoever is the first person to talk with us about a topic, that person naturally becomes the expert in our minds. Like I just saw this several weeks ago for myself. My car started making a sound, and so I texted a friend and was like, "Hey, can I swing by your house with my car and have your husband look at it tonight to tell me if I need to take it in to see, a mechanic?" And she was like, "Sure." So I showed up at her house, and as her husband was coming out of the house, he's like, "Elizabeth, I'm happy to take your car out for a test drive." He's like, "But why are you asking me for help in this? I don't know anything about cars." And I had to stop and think. And I was like, yeah, why am I asking you to do this? And I realized the reason was the first month that I moved to this town where I now live, I got a flat tire on the middle of driving. And my friend's husband came to my rescue. He changed the tire for me and
Mm.
he pointed me to a garage where I could get it changed permanently. And I was like, oh my goodness, in my mind, he's now the expert on all things cars simply because he
Yep.
was the first person to help me. And so if we want our children to come to us, rather than going to a teacher or a friend
Mm,
or
sure.
Google or somewhere else for information about sexuality, we have to make sure that we're the first ones to introduce them to this topic. Then the second reason is the truth of the matter is that sexuality is inherently good because God
Mhm.
designed it. Now, are there countless ways in which we as humans have corrupted the gift of sexuality because of our
Right.
fallenness? Absolutely. We see, just countless examples of this. However, at its base, sexuality is inherently good because God designed it. And if we want our children to understand the inherent goodness of God's design for sexuality, we have to lay that biblical foundation before they encounter our human corruptions of that good design. So we have to have the basic conversations before new neighbors move in down the street and it's a family with 2 dads, or before the
Mhm.
person checking us out in the line at Costco is a man with a beard and lipstick and heels. We have to have those conversations because if we don't, then we have move into backpedaling mode where we have to explain to our kids how what they saw was not God's good design before they even know what that design is. And as an added
Mm.
bonus, if you start these conversations before the age of 7, there is only one person in the conversation who feels awkward at that time, and it's you as the parent.
That's
Because at those
right.
younger ages, they feel no shame or embarrassment whatsoever. So that's what I recommend for parents to start these conversations at a very young age so that it just naturally becomes part of your family conversation so that your children will come to you with their questions, their concerns, their anxieties, their fears, their curiosities, and you can just naturally continue to have this conversation as different situations come up in life.
Yeah, see, I love that so much. Being that first voice, you set the foundation, you
Mhm.
set the truth, and then you're making yourself available for them to come back later because they can trust that you will be open and honest with them. There's so much
Yes.
value in that.
Yes.
But for some parents, their hesitation is the fact that it's exposure too early and it will actually
Mhm.
diminish their innocence. Would you
Mhm.
like to speak to that a little bit about the concern that parents might have?
Yes, yes, I get this a lot when I recommend starting the
Mhm.
first of many sex talks around the age of 4,
Yes.
and usually what I will do is I'll respond by asking the parents a question. Say, if you think that talking with your child about sex, so them having knowledge that this exists, is stealing your child's innocence, what is the assumption about sex that's underlying that
Ooh,
thought
that's
process?
good.
To get them to think
Yes.
through that usually our assumption behind that thought process is sex is inherently dirty and it's shameful, and our kids, they're just much better off before they know that it exists. And from a
Mhm.
biblical perspective, that's not true. That our kids having knowledge that sex exists that's not stealing their innocence. That's just helping
Mm.
them know that this part of God's design exists. What is stealing their innocence is when we leave them unprepared for understanding the sacredness of the private parts of their bodies and the boundaries that need to be placed around those private parts, and understanding even what sex is, so that if they are exposed, and usually it's not if, it's just when they are exposed to pornographic content, they
Mhm.
know right away to turn from that. And so I usually just try to help parents reframe their thinking in that knowledge that sex exists does not steal our child's innocence. What steals our child's innocence is when they're actually exposed to material that's inappropriate, or they're exposed to somebody who has predatory motives. We're helping our kids understand the goodness of God's design is actually setting up some protective barriers to help protect them around those twistings of God's good design. So that's usually how I
Mm.
encourage parents when they're scared about, losing innocence.
Well, and you pointed this out. And essentially, we're telling our kids what is the truth. So when they're exposed to
Mhm,
the distorted aspect of sex in
mhm.
this world, they recognize that that is not God's design. And
Yes.
pornography is one of those things. I think the average
Yeah.
age, what is maybe 8 years old now,
Mhm. Yeah.
it's incredible because of the immediate access kids can have to the internet and to devices,
Mhm.
and it's unknowingly happening. That's the struggle.
Mhm.
And if kids do not feel safe coming to their parents and discussing these things, then who are they going to go to discuss it? They're either going to continue
Mhm.
on the venue of Google, or they're going to
Mhm.
go to their peers. And we don't know what kind of information or distorted view they're being provided.
Mhm.
And so talk a little bit about how can parents talk to their kids about
Mhm.
pornography and even masturbation, because we know this
Mhm.
is happening even earlier due to the fact that our bodies are made with stimulus and nerves, and it does
Yeah.
feel good. So
Yeah.
what are some of those conversations you could start having with kiddos?
Yeah, these are conversations again that I recommend having a little bit younger than we would have traditionally thought in the past. So first I'll talk about pornography in particular. And as you said, Paige, the average age of exposure is 8. And
Mhm.
so that if that's the average age, that means some will see it earlier, some will see it later. So we have to prepare our kids well before the age of 8. So, what I recommend again is that parents start this conversation somewhere around the age of 4 or 5. And now I know people are like, oh my goodness, you have got to be kidding me. Well, let me explain how you can begin this conversation in a developmentally appropriate way so that you're not unnecessarily burdening your child, but you are protecting them through preparing them for what
Yeah,
to do
that's
when
good.
they encounter pornography. So, I recommend starting off with what is positive, sandwiching in the middle the negative, and then closing with what is positive. So start off by just going on a picture walk throughout your house and saying, let's look at all the pictures we have hung up. Let's talk about all these good pictures, and look at the picture of your wedding and talk about, oh, this picture reminds us of how much your dad and I love one another. Or this picture, of our family vacation at the lake reminds us of how much fun we had on that trip. Or this picture of our dog, reminds us of how much we love her. Just talk through all of those good pictures.
Mhm.
And you can say, you know what? Because of sin, not all pictures are good pictures. And then this is where you just basically explain you don't have to use the word pornography at a younger age. You can just say, because of sin, there are some bad pictures. And these bad pictures are either pictures or videos of people that don't have clothes covering those special parts of our body that a bathing suit was designed to cover. And then you can just explain it really simply and say, these are bad pictures because they're not treating the people in the pictures or the videos like they bear God's image. And they're not treating the people that are looking at them like they bear God's image. And then say, you know what? One day, if you see a bad picture or bad video, there's 3 things I want you to do. I want you to stop, run, and tell. So give them that 3-step formula: stop, run, and tell. 1, stop looking at the picture right away. 2, run to me or the nearest safe adult. And 3, tell me what you saw so that I can work to protect you from seeing that kind of picture again. And then just go through that again. It's stop, run, tell. Then sandwich it off, close it off by saying, okay, you know what? What I want us to mostly focus on are good pictures. So let's talk through what are some of the other good pictures that we see around us every day, and close it off by talking about good pictures. And then you're going to want to continue this conversation, at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way into the teen years. Just talking about, like, remember we talked about what bad pictures are, what's the game plan for if you see a bad picture? As your kids are 9, 10, 11, you can actually introduce the word pornography. And then at those ages, when our children are starting, to enter the puberty years, then the conversation becomes a little bit different because, at 5, the child does not have any sexual desires, so they just need a game plan for what to do when they see that picture. At the older ages, they actually need a game plan, of understanding why they are to do that. That you might feel one of two things. When you see a bad picture or bad video, you might feel really ashamed and embarrassed,
Mm,
and you just want to
sure.
hide it from me and everybody else. And you know what? That's a natural feeling, because that's something that is not good. It's something that's sinful, but you didn't sin by stumbling across that. So I want you to come and tell me. Or you might feel really curious. You might actually like what you saw. And that's because God designed us to be attracted to other people. But still, these pictures and images, they're not treating others like they bear God's image. And they're not treating you, who's viewing them, like you bear God's image. So again, right away, need to stop looking at it. Come right to me. Tell me what you saw so I can help protect you. So that's just a basic game plan for pornography. The masturbation question, I don't recommend starting around the age of 4. Thank God you don't have to start. Thank God you don't have to start that one quite that young. However, I do recommend, and it's probably younger than what most people are hoping for, but I do recommend around the age of 8 starting that
Mm,
conversation. And the reason for that is simply because the sex ed curriculums that are used in many schools, they introduce the topic, many of them introduce the topic of masturbation around the age of 3rd grade. And so even if your
I
child,
had no idea.
yeah,
In what context? Like, are they just reading books in circle time? Like,
so
what?
with some of the just the sex ed standards that are used by different states, it just introduces kids to different forms of sex, even at that
Wow.
young age. And one of the forms that it introduces them to is just self-stimulated sexual activity. And so
Wow.
again, we don't have to go into graphic detail, but we're going to want to make sure our kids just know what this is, because
Mhm.
even if our kids are in private school or we homeschool them or we're very careful about what they're exposed to, there's going to be kids just around them,
Yep.
who have been exposed to this. So I recommend, around the age of 8 or 9, just having this conversation and saying, sometimes what people do is they will touch their private parts in a way that makes it feel like they're having sex. And you can just explain, this is different than when you're cleaning yourself up after you use the bathroom.
Mhm.
That's something we all need to do. But say people will do this, and this is called masturbation. So just give them this word. And then by this point, if by the time they're 8 or 9, you should have already had hopefully many sexuality talks with them. And some of those talks should have been about, what is the purpose of sex? Like, why did God give sex to humans? And in the Bible, there's 3 pretty explicit purposes to sex. One of them is to be fruitful and multiply. It's a command that humans have been given in Genesis 1. And the way that we are physically fruitful through multiplying and having more humans is by having sex, by making more babies. And so talk about, God gave sex to husbands and wives so that they could have children. Then talk about, God gave sex so that husbands and wives could get to know one another and enjoy one another in a way that they don't know or enjoy anyone else. And that's made clear through the fact that the Old Testament word for sexual intercourse between a husband and wife is the Hebrew word yada, which means to know, to have intimate knowledge of someone. And then the third picture that we get in scripture in Ephesians 5 is that all of marriage, including the sexual union, is a picture of Christ and the church. And say, okay, let's think about these 3 purposes God has given us for sex. It's to have babies, for a husband and wife to get to know one another, and to be a picture of Jesus and the church. If somebody is just by themselves and they're touching their private parts in this way, can they be fruitful and multiply? No, they can't, because they're just by themselves, and it takes a man's body and a woman's body to make a baby. Okay, can somebody get to know their husband or their wife better by just being by themselves? No, so it's not doing that. And then we talked about Ephesians 5 makes clear that sex is a picture of Jesus and the church. Can somebody portray that picture when they're by themselves? No, because it's just one person. And so then explain, because it doesn't fit into any of God's purposes for sex, masturbation is not something that God has called us to. And then you can ask your child if they have any questions, because at this young of an age, it might just seem confusing. It just like,
Mhm.
what is this? Why, why would people do this? And now I know allowing our kids to ask questions can be really, really scary, because we're like,
Yeah.
what are they going to ask us? Like, what if they ask me something I don't know the answer to? Or what if they ask me something disgusting or embarrassing? And so that's where I recommend that if your child asks you something that just kind of like completely takes you off guard or knocks you off your feet, keep your poker face on. Okay. So
Mhm.
have a smile, because we want to affirm their questions so that they come to us with their questions and say,
That's
what?
right.
I am so grateful that God has given you a mind that thinks really clearly and well. I'm so proud of you. And you know what? I'm going to need a little more time to answer this question. So tomorrow after dinner, or whenever you have time within the next 24 hours, we're going to come back and talk about this. And what you just did is two things. One, you have let your child know that you want them to come to you with their questions. And two, you just bought yourself 24 hours to gain your composure, to do some research, to
Yes.
talk to your spouse or somebody else about how do I respond to this question. So that's what I recommend when talking about masturbation or any other tricky topic with our children.
Wow. It is just making me think through some of the marriage counseling I have done even
Mm,
recently. Unfortunately, it's
mm,
had to do with pornography and that there has been an addiction
mm.
level with one of the spouses.
Yeah.
There's even conversations about the masturbation and how that can be okay. And some people view
Mm,
pornography as being okay, even within
mm.
Christian
Yeah.
couples. And so, what I'm not sure I've ever really seen this in a counseling case, but I know I have heard of it, is that the way the child is exposed is because the pornography is on the device of the parent.
Mm,
So maybe speak to the other parent, that not the one that struggles in the sin bent area, but maybe their partner doesn't see the problem with pornography or masturbation or some of those things. What's some encouragement you can give them in how they parent their kids if
mhm.
they're potentially exposed?
Yeah. So, my encouragement to anybody who's in that situation where you and your spouse, are not on the same page with parenting, to first think very clearly, is what, my spouse and I are not on the same page with, is it actually regarding sin or is it regarding preferences? Because there could be a situation where you don't want your child on any device ever, and your
Hmm.
spouse thinks, you know what, it's really not that big of a deal. And so, if it's just a matter of wisdom, this is where you need to have conversations and then ultimately leave it in the Lord's hands. And if it's about sin, that's a different issue. If your
Hmm.
spouse is okay with your child viewing pornography and it's like, oh, like it's not that big a deal. It's not that big a deal. That is engaging in sin. And so that is where you need to put your foot down and say, you know what, whenever, our son or our daughter is with me, I am not going to allow this, because
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is sin. Obviously, you don't have control over what your spouse does and you can't control them. But I would just encourage people to discern between those two things. Is this an issue of wisdom, or is this a matter of sin? Because in the matters of sin, that is where you need to put your foot down. Where in the matters of wisdom, that's where you need to have conversations and then ultimately say, okay, Lord, I'm trusting, I'm trusting you with this,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I don't have control over this situation. So that's where I would encourage parents in that area. Also, I think if we can help our children have a really firm biblical understanding, that's going to go so much farther than just being like, this is bad, stay away from
Hmm.
this, because that will help them understand, in situations where you and your spouse might be in conflict over what you think you should do. It will help your children be discerning in that situation, because obviously you don't want to speak negatively about your spouse in front of your children. That's not what you're called to do, but you do just
That's
want to
right.
raise your kids up in wisdom. So that's what I would encourage. But Paige, you're more the expert in this marriage counseling situation. So is there anything that I said that you would
Oh,
change or that you would
gosh.
add to there?
I'm not sure that I would. I think what we're unfortunately seeing more of as well is that these pornographic relationships are happening with technology. Like, I've learned so much
Mhm.
more about Chat GPT and
Mhm.
those, even just like the pictures that can be created from that. And so
Mhm.
it's just heartbreaking in some of the counseling that I've been having recently, of just these individuals truly view that their relationship with an inanimate object, they refer to it as computer, is not infidelity. And so we have
Mhm.
totally gone a
Mhm.
completely different direction when it comes to
Mhm.
what is sexual integrity and the way that God designed it. And so
Mhm.
I think my encouragement to the families out there that might be going through this, and maybe it's not the sexual intimacy or the sexual conversations with your kids that you're differing on. Maybe it's even just faith. Maybe it's some of these
Mhm.
other ways. It's like, you can trust that the Lord is pursuing your spouse
Mhm.
and wants his heart to know, or wants her heart to know the Lord in a deep, intimate intimate way. So your continuation of prayer over that relationship, and I love how Elizabeth said is you don't have control over it anyways. The more that you nag and you poke and sometimes passive aggressively try to educate your spouse, that's actually going to lead them in a different direction. And it's not going to lead them to hope. It's not going to lead them to the love of Jesus. And so we model well by the way that we educate our kids. We have those conversations with our kids because we still have influence and power over what we educate our kids. So for me, my husband may not align with some of my values that I have. That's okay, because my kids, well, as Elizabeth said, I will teach them and then they will critically look at what is right and what is truth, because I lead them straight to the word of God, and that is truth over all. And we are just so thankful that that guides us. But it's a hard one. It really is. And it just breaks my heart. But yeah, so I would just say overall, pray, continue to educate. Your voice has value, and know that the Holy Spirit is coming after your spouse's heart. And hopefully that's where the transformative work happens. So yeah.
Amen.
Now let's transition into some of the gender conversations. I know that I have kids that are in high school. I have one in college now that actually attends a public university. And so the things that they are exposed to is very different than when I was exposed to in the 90s, by the way. It's like
Yeah.
totally different. And so I'm glad that I had those conversations from the beginning with them. But even still, I mean, it changes so frequently. I mean, that's why it's the LGBTQ plus, because the plus adds on almost every single year. And so how can you help your kids at all ages, age appropriately, understand gender and what the world is saying about what it should look like?
Yeah, well, I recommend starting off with the same formula I recommend for any question. We always have to start off with what is the biblical foundation for this, and fortunately the biblical foundation for being male or female starts off in the first chapter of the Bible. In Genesis 1:27, it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So we just need to take our kids right there and say, okay, what does this verse talk about God's design? It reveals two truths. One, that God designed us in his image, and two, that God designed us as distinctly male or distinctly female. And so we want our kids from the youngest of ages, whether they're 4 or 14, to understand that this is the truth that the Bible presents from chapter 1, from its opening chapter. And then we want to help our kids understand the goodness of that design, and then how sin has affected that design. And so to talk through all the ways, the beauty that you see in your child, if she's a girl, like what are all the amazing qualities that you see in her as a female, how she reflects God. If your child is a male, what are all the amazing qualities that you see in him as an image bearer of God? And this is where I think our language can be really powerful. As we're affirming our kids in the ways that God has gifted them, we can affirm that God has gifted them as distinctly male or distinctly female. If we have a daughter who's really good at soccer, we can just continually say, I'm so grateful for how God designed you as a girl who reflects him so well in your athletic ability, or whatever your daughter is good at. If you have a son, who is really artistic, can say, I'm so grateful that God has designed you as a boy who reflects his image in the way that you do art, or whatever your son is good at.
So good.
Just reflect that in your language so that they're constantly hearing themselves affirmed as an image bearer of God who is created as distinctly male or distinctly female. And then I recommend after that, when, as we're continuing to build this positive biblical foundation, then introduce, how has sin corrupted God's good design? And so a simple way to explain homosexuality to kids in the younger ages, again, we're going to build upon this, as they grow, but just explaining, that God designed different types of love for different relationships. God has given us friendship love. It's a gift. We can be friends with whoever. There's no limit on how many friends we can have. God designed friendship love as a gift, that friends love one another and they care for one another. And that's such a gift. Then God has given us marriage love, and that's between one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life. That's right in Genesis 2. At the end of the chapter, God brings Eve to Adam, and Moses writes, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And so talk about how marriage love is good. It's a commitment between one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life. And this is different than friendship love in that marriage love is exclusive. It requires one man, it requires one woman, and that's it. It's this closed off relationship that honors God. And then talk about how God has given us family love. He's given us parents and grandparents and siblings and nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles. And marriage love is great, that families are supposed to stick together and love one another and support one another. And then explain that because of sin, sin, sometimes we might desire the wrong kind of love in a relationship.
That's
And
good.
say, because of sin, sometimes what God designed to be friendship love between two men or two women, those men or women might desire to turn that friendship love into the marriage type of love. And then talk about, is this what God designed? Well, no, God designed marriage to be one man and one woman. And God designed it to be a picture of Christ and the church. And so then to help our kids understand how this doesn't fulfill God's purposes there. And similarly, when we're talking about transgenderism, talking about the goodness of God's design being distinctly male and distinctly female. And then explaining to our kids, because of sin, sometimes our feelings can trick us. And you can just bring in an example, really humbly about sometime your feelings tricked you and your kids saw it. You can say,
Absolutely.
like, do you remember last week when I asked you to clean up your room? And you didn't. And then I came in and
Mhm.
I yelled at you for 5 minutes. And you can say, I did need to discipline you because you disobeyed me. However, I let my feelings of anger and frustration trick me into believing that yelling at you was the best thing, where I wasn't treating you like you were bearing God's image. And so just talk about times feelings have tricked you. You can ask your kids if they can think of any times feelings have tricked them. Then say, you know what, because of sin, sometimes someone's feelings about being a man or a woman might trick them to believing that they're the opposite of what their body reveals. Like sometimes a man might really like a lot of things that many women like, or might be good at things that a lot of women are good at. And he lets his feelings trick him into believing that he actually is a woman when his body reveals the truth that God has designed him as a man, and explain the same thing
Mm,
can happen to females.
that's
And so
so
just
good.
so our kids have this basic understanding of what is God's design, how has sin corrupted this, and then you need a game plan for moving forward. So I just think
Mhm.
about times when I've been with my friends with younger kids, and whatever has been going on in their head just comes out of their mouths. They're
Yes,
explaining this
no
to like
filter.
5, 6, 7-year-old. I was thinking I went out to dinner with a friend just at Chick-fil-A with her and her 2 sons. And at the time, I think her sons were 4 and 5. And so she and I are eating dinner, in a booth, and her sons are off in the play place. And in the middle of dinner, one of her sons opens up the door to the play place. And for the whole restaurant to hear, he shouts out, "Mom, someone in here does not know Jesus. They do not know Jesus." And then he thinks for a minute and he shouts out, "Is that a sin against God?" And she handled it so well. She was just like, "Come here, bud, let's talk about it." But, if we're explaining to our kids that marriage is one man and one woman, and we're explaining that,
Mhm.
our bodies reveal the truth about whether we're male or female, we don't want our kids to be out in public and then, point the finger at the gay couple who's having dinner next to us, or,
Absolutely.
and so I recommend parents just present to their kids, no matter their age, just a 3-step formula. One, we do need to recognize this is not God's good design. It's important
Mm,
that we recognize, that if we see two men who are in a romantic relationship or two women who are in a romantic relationship, this is not what God designed. The second step is to remind yourself of the truth. So we want to just teach our kids, just in your mind, you're going to just repeat, what is God's truth about this, and that might be, God designed marriage as one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life. God's design is good. Or God designed us in his image as male or female. God's design is good. So, and then the third step is to be kind, that we are
mhm.
called to love others. So, yes, we do need to recognize this isn't God's good design. We do need to remind ourselves of the truth. And then we need to love this person as we would love any other
Mm,
person. So,
love
and we
that.
just, keep that conversation going as our kids get older.
Absolutely. I remember a season when my youngest was really young. We were grocery shopping and a gentleman was dressed in a dress. And he had questions because
Mhm.
we have raised our kids to understand God's design in this. And so I so appreciated his curiosity and I met him in that curiosity and we
Mhm.
discussed it. And it became such a good learning
Mhm.
opportunity. And that's what I want to encourage parents is like, yes, this
Yeah.
is scary, but how beautiful of a moment that you turn this into a teaching moment. Now, I could
Mhm.
have, because he did announce to the aisle in the grocery store to be ashamed, and I could be embarrassed by that. But instead, I leaned in and I said, you know what, that is good curiosity.
Mhm.
Let's talk about that. But
Mhm.
then on the flip side, but how also can we love this individual
Yeah.
like Jesus does? Because I love that wording that you use, tricked. I talk to a lot of kids about that as well, is about,
Mhm.
feelings. We can't trust our feelings because they can lie to us. We can't always
Mhm.
abide by what the world tells us because that can also be distorted in lies. And so, yeah, just helping our
Mhm.
kids be critical thinkers, but also, regardless, that is still a child of God. We still need to honor, respect, and love them. And if anything, even pray for them so that their eyes can be opened, so that
Mhm.
they can truly live in the design that God has designed for them, which we know is the best for them. So, Elizabeth, again, thank you so much for joining me today. I would love for everyone to find Federation Worldview and obviously this book as well. And so, where can they find your information? Where can they connect with you?
Yeah. So if you can just remember the name of the company, Foundation Worldview, just go to foundationworldview.com and you can find out all the information about all the resources that we have there, including the book. Or if you just want to go and find the book, if you go to Amazon or any book site that is your site of choice, it should be on there.
Awesome. Well, again, all that Federation Worldview does or I'm sorry, all that Foundation Worldview does. We appreciate your curriculum. We love that you equip adults to have these hard conversations. So just praying a blessing over you and your ministry as you continue to just bring God's kingdom here. So thank you for all of that.
Oh, thanks so much for the encouragement, Paige. And thanks for having me on again today. It's just been a joy to chat with you.
Well, hey friends, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I was just talking to my producer offline as I wish Elizabeth was in my life when my kids were little. I mean, the language that she uses, the way that she can articulate so clearly and giving you pointers of how can you interject this important topic with your kids, even though you're uncomfortable, knowing that it's going to inform their identity in a biblical worldview. Like just so powerful. And so I know that you probably have tons of takeaways. I just want to share a little bit of mine. And for those out there that might have grown up in a different environment, maybe your parents weren't believers. And so in my case, for instance, I grew up in a dual home where my dad was and is still an atheist. And then my mom was a believer. So she's the one that took us to church. She shared a little bit about the biblical worldview. She told us who Jesus was and who Jesus said we were. My father, on the other hand, had a very scientific mind and pretty much he grew up in the 60s. So his mindset when it comes to sexual relationships was very much a free love. And so I was exposed, unfortunately, to pornography at a very young age. That, of course, really messed with my head because I did not feel like I had a safe relationship with either parent to go and talk to them about what I saw and what that meant about my identity and who I am in a sexual relationship with my future married partner. So, for me to raise my kids, I made sure that I was first educating myself, reading content like Elizabeth's book. This is so important. You got to find all the books out there to start having these conversations so you are equipped. So, not only Elizabeth's, the Foundation Worldview, Dr. Jim Burns, he's written several books that talks through gender and sexual identity and how to talk to your kids about this. That was one of the first things that I did when I started having kids is please educate me about how can I raise my kids with a biblical worldview because I wasn't raised that way. And our family of origin does have an impact in how we respond because sometimes we go back to that default parenting style that we saw when we were raised. So make sure you educate yourself. What a great book with Elizabeth and what a wonderful podcast even. The content that she shared today is a great foundation for you moving forward. So be mindful of making sure that you are surrounding yourself with information to equip you and have these conversations. Yes. Now, I realize that when she said that starting these conversations should start at 4 years old, many of you probably choked, you might have even had a mini panic attack. Let me tell you though, it is not as scary as it sounds because at that age, they don't fully understand, nor do they have the shame associated with the sex talk that we might have as adults. So, slowly integrating throughout maybe just daily conversations can be such an integral part for your kids to understand who Jesus says they are, who Jesus says their body is, as well as intimate relationships that they are ultimately designed for as they move into adulthood and to become married. You get to speak the truth over them before the world has that ability. Most cases, praise God for that. Now, for those out there that might have children that have been exposed to maybe pornography or the predatory experiences, let me tell you that the Lord can still come and heal those areas in your child. There exposure to the distorted worldview does not mean that they now are forever informed that that's going to be the truth in their life. Instead, you still get to speak truth and redemption over what they've been exposed to. And I'm not just talking about littles. I'm talking about when you find out for the first time your child's been exposed to pornography, and maybe they're a teenager by that point. Sitting them down and having those hard conversations is going to be so important because, first, it takes away the shame that they might be experiencing because they've unintentionally or intentionally walked into seeing pictures that they never were designed to see or experience. Take away the shame from them, talk about the forgiveness, and then talk about their ultimate design. What did God design for them? Talk about the fact that maybe now that's opened up a temptation that they never had before. What an amazing opportunity to talk through how to build resilience in temptation. Because if it doesn't start now, it's certainly going to start in their adulthood, maybe not even just with lust issues, but we are in a fallen world. Therefore, we will have temptation. So you get to speak to them and equip them in some of those areas. And I think just moving forward with our own partner, our spouse, having these conversations on the front end, especially when our kids are young, talking through what are our values, making sure that we're in alignment. Maybe we're not. That is another conversation we need to have. And Elizabeth brought up the good point of just talking through, we may not have the same values with some of these ideas, but how can we parent in a biblically focused way so that we raise our kids with health? That's the big thing out there, friends, is pornography is shown to change brains. You cannot argue against the science of the brain scans of someone that has even seen, nor the addictive level that pornography can produce. So no longer is it about pornography does not harm. We are seeing evidence of that. That can become part of the conversation that you have with your spouse if they potentially see that pornography might not be a difficult or an issue in their lives or in the lives of others. Another good thing that I love that she talked about is that being that open space that when your kids, you start initiating those hard conversations, your kids know that they can come and talk to you about that. But you have to make sure that you're in a good place to receive it. She called it a poker face. I call it Botox face. We have to learn as parents that when we have a certain inflection in our voice or the eyebrow raise or the way that we even ask questions, don't ask me why teenagers really hear things that aren't there, but perception is reality for them. We have to be cautious. We want to be a safe place. And sometimes it can even say to our kids is, you know what, I didn't respond well to that. Can we start over? Or, you know what, I'm not sure how to answer that question. But we can always start with the praise of, thank you for coming to me. Thank you for being curious. Thank you for asking this hard question, because I'm sure it took bravery. Love that we get to do this and walk alongside our kids in such a beautiful, powerful way. And some of these awkward areas where you know the world is willing to disciple them, but we want to make sure that Jesus is the only discipler of our kids and our family. So make sure you forward on this podcast to all your friends and family, because what an amazing way to bond with your friends and family than talking about how to have multiple sex talks with your kids in age-appropriate, biblical worldview way. So thanks again so much for listening to the show. I'm so grateful that you chose to spend time with us each week. I would love to hear from you. So please reach out to me at paigeclingenpeel@gmail.com. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of Embracing Your Season.